Almighty God, come and be present in our midst. Open our hearts and minds and give us ears to hear you and know you. We pray for your wisdom. We pray for your truth. And most of all, we pray for your redemptive love to enfold us in your mercy and grace. We hold before your care and keeping all those who are on our hearts and minds this day, those who are suffering, those who are alone, those who are oppressed, and those who are in need of your solace and grace. Give us the will to serve you, Lord, and all persons we meet this day. And as we gather in this space, we turn our attention to you. Come, Lord, abide with us here that we may see you, that we may hear you, and that we may know you. It is in your name that we pray. Amen. First of all, I want to make sure that you have the things we prepared for you. We're so excited that you're here. We have pens and notepads over here. John has them. If you do not have a pen or a notepad, please take one. And this is for you to be able to take notes today. It's also just for you to have. It's just a gift for you. I'm very grateful to be with you here on site and online. And I'm especially excited for us to welcome Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Kelly is an amazing, amazing writer and person, and I'm honored to call her a friend. She, from 2017 to 2023, she was the dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and professor of theology. She was named the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union in November 2019, where she is now the Dean Emeritus. She also served as the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School from 23 to 24. And during the 2023 fall term, she served as Honorary Professor of Global Theology at Emmanuel Theological College in Liverpool, England. Ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1983, she currently serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and Anglican Communion canon at Newcastle Cathedral in Newcastle, England. Dr. Douglas is the author of many articles and several books, including the 2023 Grawemeyer Award-winning book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. If you're not familiar with this award, it's akin to the Pulitzer Prize in Theological Studies. Her academic work has focused on womanist theology, racial justice issues, as well as sexuality in the Black church. And her current research interest involves expanding a moral imagination and fostering more justice in the future. And she proudly serves on the New York City Homeless Coalition Board and the Public Religion and Research Institute Board. It's with great honor and gratitude that I welcome Dr. Douglas to speak to us now.
Good morning. It's thank you, my dear friend, Bishop Povey. Thank you for your gracious and generous introduction. It is truly such a joy to be with you all on this morning as you convene together as church and as diocese. I want to speak to you, if I can, this morning on what it indeed means to make a joyful noise to the Lord. What does it mean in these times in which we now find ourselves living, to make the joyful noise, which is the church's mission? So on this day, you all come together, we all come together. We must ask the question, really, what does it mean to make the joyful noise that is the church's mission? Indeed, what does it mean in the times in which we find ourselves to carry forth the mission of the church in times that are polarizing, that are warring, that are dehumanizing? Ours as I don't need to tell any of you, is a time of not just divide and conquer politics, but of disparaging and destroying those with whom we politically and ideologically disagree. What does it mean to carry forth the mission of the church in these times of terroristic bigotry and genocidal wars? What does it mean to make the joyful noise that is the mission of the church in this our time where 240 civilians were made hostage and more than 1,200 Israelis were murdered during the Hamas terrorism 1 year ago, and over 1 year later, still over 100 men, women, and children are being hostage, even as anti-Semitism is on the rise? What does it mean to carry forth the mission of the church when more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed since the 12-month war in Gaza, with most of those being women and children, even as Islamophobia is on the rise? How do we make the joyful noise that is the church's mission in the world? How do we carry forth the church's mission in a time when, in the words of Archbishop of Canterbury Welby, such immense suffering is allowed to continue, forgotten by most of the world in places like Sudan? For ours is a time where Sudan is on the precipice of horrifying humanitarian disaster. Just 2 days ago, the United Nations experts issued a statement warning that Sudan faces one of the worst famines in decades. According to this statement, a staggering 97% of Sudan's eternally displaced persons and civilians who remain in their homes are facing severe levels of hunger. At least 700,000 Sudanese children are suffering severe malnutrition. How do we carry forth the church's mission in this time and world of ours that tacitly accepts the suffering and ongoing dehumanizing war against LGBTQ plus and gender expansive human beings? This dehumanization has been virtually accepted as the stuff of politics and normal policymaking. The American Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking at least 484 anti-LGBTQ plus bills in our country. It further reports that since 2020, over 100 bills attacking transgender persons have been introduced into our various state legislatures. Needless to say, my friends, these bills are not benign. They have real life and death consequences for real human beings, especially for LGBTQ plus youth. Various studies have reported a correlation between these bills and anti-LGBTQ plus school bullying and hate crimes, and an even steeper rise in LGBTQ plus suicidality. Policy matters. And so, how do we make the joyful noise that is the church's mission in this our time, when in fact polarization, war, and dehumanization seems to be the acceptable norm? Inasmuch as the church's mission is fundamentally about spreading the gospel, and it is, then the church's mission involves working for a lasting and a just peace. A lasting peace is about more than the cessation of war or even the absence of disagreement, tension, and conflict. The measure of a lasting peace is the presence of justice. In this regard, a lasting peace is indeed a just peace. To make the joyful noise that is the church's mission is to foster a just peace. Now, I know that you all are sitting there thinking, yeah, that's right, but it's easier said than done. So how do we do that? What does fostering a just peace require? What does it look like? I believe, and I'll do this quickly, that a just peace requires what I consider to be two paradigm shifts: an intentional and profound shift in how we understand mission in the first place, and a profound shift in how we conceive of violence. Let me first turn to a shift in mission. Historically, a conversion paradigm has defined our understanding of the Christian mission, of our church's mission. As such, the overall aim of this missionary project was about converting people, commonly referred, as we know, to heathens, to the faith and practices of Christianity. Such conversion became synonymous with socializing and assimilating people into a particular way of living and thinking. Essentially, conversion to Christianity meant conversion to the culture and subjugation to the missional, as I call them, aggressors. Such a conversion paradigm characteristically disrespected the indigenous religions of the missionary recipients. Disrespected their way of life, their values, let alone their human and non-human resources. This conversion paradigm essentially makes victims of those who are to be converted. In the end, mission success within this paradigm is measured by the convert's subservience to the religion, culture, and even the ways and whims of missionaries. As we have often heard the phrase, when they came, we had the land and they had the Bible. When they left, we had the land and we had the Bible and they had the land. Now, perhaps needless to say, why am I talking about this kind of conversion paradigm? It is one that has been an historically prevailing paradigm within our church. And as such, it has provided theological legitimation, that is a Christian sacred canopy for the exploitation, enslavement, if not extermination of various peoples, namely non-white peoples. It is also worth noting that the legacy of this model can be seen in various manifestations of the threat that we face in our faith today, and that is the threat of white Christian nationalism. The point of the matter is that this conversion paradigm of mission, in whatever form it might take, is indeed antithetical to what it means to spread the gospel. That is to forging a just peace. That is to the joyful noise. That is to be the church's mission. Moreover, and I will point out further later, this conversion paradigm perpetuates violence. It is the missionary culprit, if you will, that fosters the kind of polarized, divisive, and divisive times in which we now find ourselves living. And thus, the imperative for us to rethink the meaning of mission for the church is the gospel imperative to foster a different kind of world. That is a world characterized by just peace. And this brings me to what I call a liberative paradigm of mission that we must adopt. A liberative paradigm of mission is defined not by converting people to our faith. Rather, it is defined by liberating, that is, freeing people from whatever it is that prevents them from living into the future that God promises and desires for God's world and for God's people. In the words of our presiding bishop, this is a future where all are loved, where justice is done, and where the God-given equality of all of us is honored. This is what just peace looks like. True mission, therefore, is not about thrusting a particular culture, way of life, or even faith onto a people. To the contrary, it is about fostering God's just future and thus doing the work of God. In theological terms, it is about the Missio Dei, properly understood. Therefore, Christian mission is not about a response to politicians, governments, or institutions sending us into the world to spread our religion and way of life. Instead, it is a response to God's eternal mission to partner with God and to cultivate and create a loving and just world. Our mission is about joining God in God's mission. And so, it is that inasmuch as mission is about spreading the gospel, it is about nothing less than making real in the world the good news of God's just future, making that real in our present. Thus, we as church are to be agents of God's mission. We are to be accountable not to human demands, but I cannot say enough, accountable to the demands and call of God. And so in the places in which we find ourselves, we are called to liberative work, liberating the places where the places that stand against a just peace. Now, it is in this way that Christian mission, while not violent, is unavoidably disruptive. I will borrow from the theory of a just peace pioneer, Johann Galtung, as he talked about violence, so that we can understand what it really means for a just peace to stop the violence. Galtung points out that violence is that, and he's right, which is an insult to life. Violence, then, is anything that harms or devalues the life that God has granted to us all. Now, Galtung gives us, I think, a very helpful model, and we will see how this plays out in our church. And that is, he talks about violence in at least three interrelated ways. Direct violence, as you can see at the top, is best understood as an event, such as war, famine, or some kind of aggressive physical act that poses a direct, if not immediate, threat to life. If direct violence is an event, then we see at the bottom of the triangle, then structural violence is a process with its ups and downs that creates insidious and systemic patterns of exploitation, inequality, and oppression. Structural violence is, in general, systemic and structural injustice. Lastly, there's cultural violence. Cultural violence is sort of that symbolic sphere of existence. Cultural violence is found in our language, in our arts, in our symbols, in our religion. As such, cultural violence is about a slow transformation process that ultimately distorts our thinking and corrupts our moral imaginary, making direct and structural violence appear and feel right, or to at least feel not wrong. It makes structural and direct violence appear normal. It becomes the norm, the way in which we insult and violate the humanity and lives of other people. Cultural violence, in the end, renders direct and structural violence acceptable. Now, it is an appreciation of direct structural and cultural violence that we can begin to recognize the ways, one, in which a conversion model of missionary is a perpetuator of violence. As a missionary model focused on converting people to a particular way of life and a particular faith tradition with little or no regard for their own way of life or their own faith traditions. It is at base, this conversion model of mission work is at base culturally violent. It is in this way that a conversion paradigm of mission is the productive, legitimating core of direct, structural, and cultural web of violence. Now, this means that a liberative paradigm of mission, the mission that the church is called to, is essential to stopping the violence that characterizes our present and thus is crucial to fostering the just peace that is the good news of God's gospel. That a liberative, not conversion model of mission is the essence of the church's mission is made clear through the life and ministry of Jesus, who summarized what it meant for him to be the incarnate reality of God's work and mission in our world. That is to make the joyful noise that is God's gospel mission. He summarized that with his first public proclamation, and you all know it. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of the sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. And so what does it mean then to carry out the church's mission in this our present world? Again, a liberative mission for the church. To reiterate, it does mean stopping the violence, which is essential to just peacemaking. But what does it look like? How do we do that? How give us some practical ways now of carrying forth the church's mission. First and foremost, It requires that we engage our work from the perspective of those whose lives and life conditions have been harmed by violence. This means listening and learning from those on the underside of justice, those who have been made to suffer under the weight of the intersecting realities of direct, structural, and cultural violence. And this brings me back for a moment to the matter of violence itself. For far too often, violence has been understood from the perspective of those who carry forth, if we will, an oppressive, colonizing kind of oppressive legacy. In other words, from the perspective of the powerful and dominant classes. Consequently, we know that outcries to stop the violence typically only emerge in response to the direct violence of those that are victims of the multidimensional realities of violence in the first place. It is when they are pushed, those that are oppressed by structural and cultural and even direct violence, when they are pushed to acts of violence in an effort to free themselves from violence that has engulfed their lives, it is then when we hear the outrage and the self-righteous indignation and the Christian self-righteousness about the scourge of violence and the calls for stopping the violence. My friends, remember, violence breeds violence. The direct violence that erupts from those who are subjugated and oppressed is invariably the violence that violence has created. And so if the church's mission is to stop the violence, then the outrage must be directed at the precipitating violence that are cultural and structural injustice. This is the violence. If we're confused with what that is the violence that is poverty with its comorbidities of indecent housing, lack of educational, employment, healthcare, and recreational opportunities. It is the violence that is an occupied country or land. It is the violence that is terrorism. It is the violence that is famine and food insecurity. It is the violence that is xenophobia, bigotry, anti-LGBTQ terrorism, and the list can go on. You know what it is. It is the violence of white supremacy. Furthermore, inasmuch as a liberative missionary project centers the perspective of the victims, it must also hear from them and how the complex interplay of direct structural and cultural violence is an insult to their life and living and how it truly impacts their lives. Essentially, the fundamental task of the church's mission is not to assume what living under such violent realities means, but rather to learn from its victims the multi-nefarious impact of such violence on their lives, and thus what freedom from such violence would look like for them, not for us, but for them. How often is it that we good Christians go into situations assuming what is best for those who suffer and what it is they need, and then we get mad when the recipients of our missionary goodwill reject what it is we are offering. Someone once said to me that they bought us coats, but we did not need coats. We did not ask for coats. They should have asked us for what we needed. The point is, as I have said many times before, it is only when those who have been on the underside of justice began to experience justice itself that we will know that we are on the arc of the gospel good news that is a future defined by a just peace, that we will know that we are truly doing the work of Christian mission. This brings us to the second task of a liberative missionary project, which is the church's mission, and that is resisting and protesting that which stands in opposition to all that diminishes or negates the opportunities for persons to grow into the fullness of whomever God has created them to be, and thus preventing them from enjoying the abundance of life that God promises us all. Just peacemaking is found in the ways in which people advocate for and foster the abundance of life that is God's to be shared by all, which means creating spaces within our communities, within our homes, within our churches of freedom, equity, and empathy for all those who have been denied that in our world, in our society, and even in our religious institutions. So this brings me to perhaps what is often the sticky wicket aspect of the church's liberative mission to just peacemaking, and that is navigating the political landscape. How often do we hear that the church's role is not to engage into the politics of our day? But here's the thing. There is no neutrality when it comes to injustice. And thus, while we are not called to be politically partisan, to spread the good news of the gospel, again, carrying out the liberative missionary project, is to be partisan when it comes to the values of God. These are values that foster justice, and thus values that preserve, cherish, respect, and enhance the sacred dignity, enhance, not diminish, enhance the sacred dignity and worth of every single solitary human beings. The values that undergird just peacemaking are those that liberate people to live into the best of their humanity, not to live down into the worst of who we can become, but to live into the best of their humanity, as opposed to enhancing values that betray the sacred humanity of all of us. In the end, a liberative mission of paradigm, that again, which the church is called to, invariably means that we must be politically engaged. And by the way, guess what? We have a model for that. Jesus. When Jesus said he came to preach good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, guess what? When he said it, he meant it. And so it was that while he didn't endorse any political party of his day or even religious sect of his day, he was political as he carried out the values of the gospel good news, as he empathized with the sick, the poor, and the marginalized, and healed them and restored them to new life, at the same time that he stood firmly against those principalities and powers that were an affront to the future that God promises is all. His mission, Jesus' mission, was his life. As I often have said, Jesus wasn't crucified because he prayed too much. He was crucified because he was political, standing against that which was an anathema to the values of God, as he stood for that which reflected God's just future. I think Archbishop Justin Welby puts it best when he said this. He said that Jesus was never party political. He said no wing of politics, left or right, can claim God as being on its side. But Jesus, Welby says, was highly political. He told the rich that unlike the poor who were blessed, that they would face woes. He criticized the king as a fox. He spoke harsh words to leaders of the nations when they were uncaring of the needy. He did this because God cares for those in need and expects those who claim to act in God's name to do the same. This means action and words. This, Welby says, is what it means to follow and to follow the Jesus who was crucified and to do the mission of the church, which is spreading God's just peace. This brings me to the final point that I want to make. Just peacemaking must begin at home, in our own backyards, in our own churches, in our own communities, institutions, and organizations. It is always easier to talk about the violent ways of others than it is to acknowledge, talk, and do something about the ways in which we are violent and complicit in the violence of others, be it wittingly or unwittingly. The liberative mission paradigm requires that we purposefully engage in what I call a violent, just peace audit of the spaces, the institutions, the organizations, the diocese, the church that we are a part of. We must ask, what are the ways in which we foster violence Directly, yes, but more significantly, because I would assume the church doesn't engage in direct violence, but it does, wittingly or unwittingly, perpetuate direct violence by engaging in structural and cultural violence. We must ask, what are the ways in which we foster this violence, therefore thwarting the possibilities of a just peace? What are the ways in which just peacemaking is a reality or not in our churches, in the spaces in which we occupy? How do the spaces we occupy, again, our churches, organizations, institutions, carry forth or are complicit in the multidimensional legacies of direct cultural and structural violence? How do we harbor it? How do we sustain it? Here's the thing. Just as Jesus Christ was the incarnate reality of God's rule, of God's just future, we who claim to be followers of him are likewise to be embodied witnesses to that very future. We are to be embodied models of just peace. We, like Jesus, are to reflect through our person, our organizations, or institutions, the already not yet reality of God's just future in our very presence. By the way, that is what it means to be church. This is what doing the church's mission looks like. This is what it is all about. And so, back to the beginning. Ours is a volatile and bordered world, made so because of the violence of injustice that permeates it. That we claim to be followers of Jesus means that we are compelled, church, to rethink the way we carry forth the church's mission so that we can effectively address the violence that shapes our world. And so it is that we are called not to convert others to Jesus, but rather to open ourselves to the claim of Jesus on our lives, to be just peacemakers in this world. This Diocese of Central New York is what it means to make a joyful noise. It is about spreading the good news of the gospel. And so as we gather, as you gather at this convention, let each of us commit ourselves to doing this work in all that we do and in all that we are, individually, institutionally, as followers of Jesus, as church. It is this work that can help stop the web of polarizing, warring, and dehumanizing violence. This is the work. This is the work of being church. May each one of us leave this convention so committed to the work that is the joyful noise of the gospel mission, the joyful noise of joining God and moving us all to a future of just peace. I'll end there. Thank you.
What a blessing to have this time with you and to hear your words. I know we have a couple of questions that people have brought forward, and looking at the continuing emergence of Christian nationalism beyond informing ourselves of strategies used by the proponents of that movement, what other strategies could small parishes do or use to defeat the co-opting of the cross into the sword?
Yes, thank you for that question, because we know that Christian nationalism has become a prevailing narrative, right, on the public square. And in so many ways, it is a corruption of our Christian faith. So what can we do as small parishes? First of all, we have to educate ourselves and educate our people on Christian nationalism itself, right? And because people aren't sure what it is, and they get confused and by it, and they say, well, aren't we indeed a Christian nation? And shouldn't we be spreading our values? And so I think the first most important thing is to educate. That our church, by request of the presiding bishop in the House of Bishops, the Theological Commission of the House of Bishops just put out a small book on Christian nationalism. And really, it's more appropriate to say white Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism is about two narratives coming together. This narrative that we are sort of this Christian nation coming together with another foundational part of our country's founding, and that is white supremacy. And so these two narratives that come together in Christian nationalism sort of places a sacred canopy over this kind of white supremacist reality. We talk about that in the document that's come out. So I would say educating our congregations on what it is, and then taking every opportunity to stand against it. I say that we cannot cede the public square. We cannot cede the space, and we have. And so the only way in which we can begin to combat Christian nationalism is to show forth another model of what it in fact means to be Christian. And so that in every space that we can, even for small parishes, just show up. My dad used to say one of the most important things we can do in life, even when we don't know what to do, is to show up. And so we can show up in a different way in our communities in regard to showing what it means to be Christian. But again, I think the first most important thing is to educate ourselves as to what it is. It's not new. And there are certain times when it reemerges with force. And of course, we're seeing that today.
Thank you. And then in this time when there is so much division and I think so much conflicting information and a lack of understanding about what's happening in the world, are there places where you're finding joy or peace as we prepare ourselves, yes, for a coming presidential election, but also in this world that is struggling right now with so much conflict? Are there places where you're seeing this work that's beginning, or something that's giving you peace, or how are you finding joy in this time?
Yeah, again, a very good question, right? And I talked about, and my joy is my hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I truly, while there are times that I feel hopeless, I mean, look at the situation in which we're in this world, in this country. And so it's hard to find hope. It's hard to be joyful. But I do find hope and joy in those places. And I mean it, and I talked about it in my most recent work or book, in those places where people are standing against that which they know to be unjust, that which they know to be not true. And so I find joy in those sort of places of protest, even when I'm not a part of them. When you see it, it's like, yeah, because when you have that, you know that's where God is moving, right? When you have that, you know that God never gives up on us, but you know that we haven't given up on God and God's future. That's the witness, right? No, God don't give up on us. Let's not give up on the just future that is God's. And so in my day-to-day, and let me tell you that I find joy. I am currently as well a visiting professor up at Harvard Divinity School. And oh my goodness, each time that I'm in that classroom with those students, another generation asking the hard questions, and even as they are trying to do the work for a future in which that will hold God's creation. They're trying to, I always talk about, we have to catch up with God when they are trying to do that work. Every single time I leave that classroom space, which I leave on Thursdays, I teach on Thursdays, I literally make a joyful noise to the Lord. I'm usually calling someone. So most of the time it's my son. I'm going, OMG, these students are good and give me such hope. for the future. So that's where I find joy.
Thank you. And I think we have two more questions here. Where are they? You talked a lot about God's just future. Talking about the future in these cosmic terms isn't always our favorite in the Episcopal Church, partly due to how other Christians use it as a scare tactic. Can you say something about how envisioning God's future is part of working for justice in the present?
No, that's exactly right. The question is, you remember that, some of you will remember, and I date myself, that old commercial about Lipton instant soup when it first came out. No one today would think that is instant because you still had to put it in a pan and put water and wait for 15 minutes or something. But the little boy would come in and say, "Is it soup yet?" Right? That's right. That's the wrong question for us to ask, right? Is the just future here yet? The just future breaks into our present in our moments of justice making, in our actions. That's when it breaks in. And so it is not about waiting for a just future to happen. It's about joining in that just future by making it present in our very reality, knowing that as we do that, we are creating even more possibilities for a more just world. And so it's not a utopian kind of vision. It is a vision that acts back into our present. The only reason that we know that justice is possible is because there are places in which people make justice known. And that's God breaking in. And so we have to continue to do that. I'll end with this and we'll get the last question. Some of you have heard me say, I've written about it, that one of the things that amazes me, right, is that there were my great-grandmother was born into slavery, that there were people that were born into slavery, that died in slavery, never, ever breathed a free breath or ever imagined that they would breathe a free breath. Yet they fought for freedom anyhow. They fought for the freedom that they knew would be, because it was the freedom that was the justice of God. And in as much as they fought for that freedom, they made God's justice real. And they certainly made God's justice real for me, because if they had not fought for it, I wouldn't be sitting here in a priest collar talking to you about it. And so that's what we mean by the justice of God. It's not some far off future. It's the future that we create for ourselves and future generations when we make justice real in our present.
Amen. And then finally, are there common factors that we can recognize when cultural violence tips into structural violence?
Oh, it's not that it tips. These three things work together. Without cultural violence, you could not sustain structural violence. Cultural violence is those things, those ideologies, those symbols, the art, the literature that makes, and other things that makes us think that these structural and systemic inequities and injustice are normal, right? It's cultural violence is it's built in many ways to the theological architecture of our faith. You know how we have these black-white sort of symbolism in our Christian architecture. And what that does is it allows for, wittingly, unwittingly, to become a part of our collective unconsciousness, this notion that white is good and black is bad. That sustains white supremacist kind of notion. So it's not that it tips in. It tips towards structural violence. These things work together. Right? You can't have one without the other. And we know that all of this leads to various forms of direct violence. And so I would say, and that's why I talk about this sort of just and violent audit. What are the ways in which we unwittingly, because I think we're all good people, right? How we unwittingly promote and foster violence. Even, when we think of direct violence, check ourselves. When are the times at which we say, oh, that's violent? Oh, we don't believe in violence. What are the times in which we say that? Do we say that when we see people, when we hear dehumanizing ideology about immigrants, LGBTQ people, people of color, the poor, when we criminalize poverty? Do we say, oh, that's violent? We don't. We usually talk about violence when people are protesting the violence that they are trapped in. And so I think those are the ways in which we began to sort of pull these things apart. This is the last question. So if I can just end with this then on this question, how do we know it? When we see it? Here's what I say. And again, some of you may have heard me say this before. It is about what I call the reverse golden rule. It is about not withholding from another that which we would not want withheld from ourselves. If we want decent housing, I think most people do, don't withhold it from another. If we want enough food to eat, don't withhold it from another. If we want to feel affirmed and loved and able to grow into whomever God has created us to be, most of us do, all of us do, then don't withhold those possibilities from another. How do we know violence, whether it's cultural or structural, when we see it or direct? We know it when we are withholding or when it withholds from another that which we would not want withheld from ourselves. And if something is doing that, structurally, ideologically, culturally, or otherwise, then it is our task to get rid of it, to resist it. It is our task then to create a world that doesn't withhold from another that which we would not want withheld from ourselves. And as we support policies, promote policies, laws, etc., and as we vote, that to me is the golden rule we should follow. And if we do that, we will, I think, more times than not, find ourselves on the side of resisting the kind of multi-layered violence that is direct, structural, and cultural.
Well, it has been a joy to have you with us. We're so grateful to learn with you and from you. And we just are grateful for this time with you. And I think we can all thank Dr. Douglas for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good convention.